Hey everyone. In this video, I would like to take you to one of the most remote and mysterious places in the world. An island lost in the Pacific Ocean, several thousand miles away from any other continent, which has fascinated explorers since its discovery for all the enigmas that surround it. How could such a small land in the middle of nowhere be populated? How could a small community of a few thousand men develop such an unique culture and erect these famous statues, the moais? There are hundreds of them on the island. These are just some of the aspects of the mysteries of Easter Island. And for today, I would like to explore with you what history and science can tell us or not about these mysteries. Before we start, I wanted to inform you that I am organizing a new survey for you to choose one of the next topics I will talk about. You will find a list of possible topics in the description, and you can vote in the comments. So you can now put your headsets on, close your eyes if you wish to, and let me guide you throughout the story. And we will begin our story 3 centuries ago, in 1722, when the first European explorers reached the island. It was a Dutch navigator who discovered it on an Easter Sunday and named the island Easter Island for this reason. And he spent about a week on the island, estimating the population to 2,000 to 3,000 inhabitants. He also noted that on the shores there were alignments of strange statues looking towards the inside of the island. But after a week he went away, and for another 50 years Easter Island did not receive any other visitor. In 1770, 2 Spanish ships reached the island, and Spain claimed this land as its own, but without actually occupying the island, so that this ownership remained rather virtual. But when these Spanish ships arrived in Easter Island, they observed that some of the statues on the shore had fallen. And 4 years later, in 1774, British explorer James Cook also visited Easter Island. Other expeditions followed in the late 18th century and early 19th century, French, Russian, and noted that now almost all the statues had fallen, indicating that something was happening on this island. Maybe the population was now unable to maintain these monuments, there had been a civil war. During the following decades, Easter Island did not generate much interest from foreigners because it was extremely remote. The closest continental point is in Chile, about 2,200 miles away from it. Slightly closer, but still fairly far, there was French Polynesia in the middle of the Pacific, about 1,600 miles from Easter Island. And given that the island was not located on a commercial route, that it was of little strategic interest, nobody really cared to claim it. Until the 1860s, when a demographic and human disaster happened in Easter Island. Slave raiders coming from Peru started to launch expeditions to capture and deport the natives. They killed or captured half the population, about 1,500 inhabitants, and even though, due to international protest, the survivors were released a few years later, they came back to the island with smallpox and other diseases against which the inhabitants were not protected, and this led to almost the entire disappearance of the native population, leaving only a few dozens survivors by the end of the 1860s. Even though there were signs of decline in Easter Island, maybe not demographically but at least culturally, before these contacts with the outside world, this disaster led to the almost complete eradication of the population. And by the end of the 1880s, now that the island was almost no longer populated, it was finally annexed by Chile, the closest continental country. Now the mysteries and the interest in Easter Island really began in the 20th century with the multiplication of scientific expeditions that showed how enigmatic this island could be. Because it was so far from any other populated area, how could the inhabitants arrive, and when? It is generally admitted that for a culture to reach a certain level of technical achievement and a certain cultural level, it needs to be in contact with other groups. It needs to have a sufficiently large population, cities, and we had known of this on Easter Island, but despite this absence of contacts with other cultures, the people in Easter Island had erected these incredible and magnificent statues, some of them up to 80 tons heavy, and they had displaced them around the island They also had elaborated a form of written language, the Rongo Rongo. All of this on an island where, in the 19th century, you couldn't find a single large tree. You couldn't find fresh water springs. The only reserves of fresh water were provided by lakes, because the island has a volcanic origin. It has been formed by 3 volcanoes, hence its triangular shape. And in these volcanoes, lakes of rain water have appeared. So how was that even possible? What happened to the population of this island, and where did it come from before the arrival of foreigners? Was it a possibility that Easter Island would be just a remain of a larger land that would have disappeared? These are some of the questions that archaeologists and scientists started to study in the 20th century. And as always, when things are hard to explain, there are various mythical, legendary, or esoterical explanations that pop up. In the case of Easter Island, there was a bit of everything. The theory that maybe Easter Island was just a remain of a mythical continent called Mu, M-U, a legendary continent that would have sunk centuries or even millennia before. And of course, the usual alien theory to explain how large statues and heavy statues had been made and moved on an island with apparently no transport vehicle. The weird and original beauty of these statues, the moais, there are hundreds of them on the island, scattered all around, has made much for the fame and fascination around Easter Island. These are statues of various size. Some of them are only 5 tons heavy, the largest ones up to 80 tons, and when they were discovered, only the heads appeared. The rest of the statues were buried. When their body was discovered, this was even more impressive because of the incredible weight of these monolithic statues. And further research also showed that these statues had eyes made of coral. They had like hats, at least some of them, made of round stones. Some of these headdresses are also several tons heavy, and they all come from a quarry in the middle of the island, where plenty of other moais, hundreds of them that were unfinished, have also been discovered. So it appeared that even before the arrival of foreign explorers, something had happened on this island, and that the production, the maintenance too, of these statues had stopped before Europeans arrived. Even though many mysteries remain and several theories coexist, a number of discoveries happened in the past decades and now makes it possible to better understand what happened. First, with radiocarbon, it has been possible to date the earliest settlements discovered on the island. And even though some of the results have been a bit controversial, it seems that the island was populated not before the 4th or 5th centuries before Christ, and maybe as late as the 12th century. The population, for at least a large part, came from Polynesia. You know that the Polynesians have been able to colonize the Pacific Ocean, traveling from one island to another, sometimes despite huge distances. But in 1947, it was proven, thanks to an experimental expedition by a navigator and anthropologist from Norway, Thor Heyerdahl, that traveling from South America to Easter Island, or from Polynesia to Easter Island, was possible on a raft, and genetic tests on what remained of the native population have shown that these inhabitants came from Polynesia. No trace of a South American genetic origin was found, because that was obviously a possibility. The closest advanced civilization that could have explained the technical achievements of the Pasquans, the inhabitants of Easter Island, was the Inca civilization. And the question of knowing whether the Incas could have had explored Easter Island remains open. There is a theory that maybe an Inca expedition arrived on the island, but proofs that this is true remain fairly scarce out of the statues themselves, and also tales in the local oral tradition, because the knowledge of this form of writing, the rongo that I mentioned before, and traces of this remain on wooden plaques, has been lost when the population of the island declined. But there are still tales about the past, saying that there was a time when two populations coexisted on the island, the so-called long ears and the short ears. The idea could be that the long ears were the population coming from South America that would have arrived on the island. And this tradition, however reliable it is, says that there was a time before the arrival of the Europeans when the short ears revolted against the long ears and exterminated them, because the long ears were the masters of the island and forced the rest of the population to build these statues. Now what we don't really know is, of course, whether these tales are true and whether these long ears were really coming from another part of the world, or if they were just a social class within the Pascuan society. So due to the absence of evidence, the Incaic theory remains an alternative. It has not been accepted by the majority of the scientific community, but that remains maybe a possibility. It appears that the moais were made to worship the ancestors, and this is something fairly usual, common in Polynesian societies, even though it took very impressive proportions on Easter Island. And actually the society that the first explorers discovered was one of several clans. There were about 10 of them when the first expedition, the Dutch expedition, arrived. All of these clans sharing the resources of the island, and they worshipped various divinities. One aspect of their religion which is particularly interesting is the worshipping of the bird man. Every now and then, in order to organize life on the island, which had limited resources, a challenge, a contest was organized between the clans. Each of them chose a champion who had to swim to a little island off the coast of Easter Island and be the first to bring back an egg from a particular nest, and the victor gave its clan the right to allocate the resources among the various clans of the island until a new challenge was organized. But before this society appeared, it seems that the island had another kind of social organization that remains mysterious, and that at some point, when the building of moais stopped, something like a revolution or a drastic change took place, and the period before, the reason for this dramatic change in the social organization remains a bit unclear. It has been established that moais were made somewhere between the 12th century and until the 17th, so not long before the arrival of Europeans. And several theories again exist about what happened on this island. One of them, which was initially very successful but has been weakened then, is that there was an ecological disaster on the island because overpopulation and building of these moais would have exhausted the resources of the island, leading to a strong reduction in the population and the appearance of a new social organization. And this theory starts with the discovery that there was a time, centuries ago, when there was a forest on Easter Island. Probably that the first settlers coming from Polynesia discovered an island that looked very different from today. But then human activity and also the making of the moais would have exhausted all the wood, making it impossible to make boats, rafts, and go fishing, so strongly reducing resources in food for the inhabitants. This theory was initially very popular, not only maybe because it could explain how the flora on the island had changed, but also because it's almost like a tale of how an ecological disaster can ruin a society. And this echoed quite well the kind of concerns that we have or have had for a few decades. But maybe, and even though some of the aspects of this theory are true, this story looked a bit too good to be true, because under some aspects, like the estimate that its author made about the size of the population before, it has been criticized, and it's also unclear what caused the deforestation of the island. It could as well be a natural phenomenon, such as a phenomenon called El Niño, which affects this part of the Pacific Ocean and can have quite strong impacts on the weather and the economy of countries in the region, like Peru in particular. Even though the moais are the most famous and maybe impressive aspect of this ancient culture, it left many other remains. There are painted caves, there are petroglyphs, which are writings engraved on stone. There are, or they had, stone houses too. They had a fascinating culture, which under many aspects reminds of the Polynesian culture, worshipping ancestors, the forces of nature, but that were adapted or evolved differently on Easter Island. And it is all this unique heritage that almost disappeared in the 19th century when the demographic catastrophe happened. Since then, and now that it was territory of Chile. The native population grew again in the 20th century. The inhabitants received the Chilean nationality in the 1960s, and in the past few decades, the development of tourism on the island, even though it remains on a small scale relatively, helped to boost the local economy, allowing a relatively large community of a few thousand persons to now live on Easter Island. As always, there would be many other things to say about this fabulous place, but this was just intended to be an introduction, and I hope you found it interesting. So I'll be happy to see your comments. I hope you like the topics I proposed in the survey and want to vote for one of them. And I'll see you soon for another video. Au revoir.